Okay, let's move on now and talk about operant conditioning, which is similar to but has a lot of differences from classical conditioning. Now, most people attribute the development of the ideas in operant conditioning to behavioral and learning psychologists, especially a psychologist named B.F. Skinner. Now, Skinner basically started out his ideas in explaining what operant conditioning is by describing the fact that whenever we do something in life, anything that you have learned how to do, anything that you would describe as behaviors that you do, according to Skinner, you do those things because over time you learned and you got reinforced, encouraging you to do those things. And things that you don't do them because you got discouraged and reinforced and punished for doing those things over time. Most people associate this kind of conditioning, operant conditioning, with criminal behavior a lot more than they do classical conditioning. Because the whole idea in operant conditioning is we respond and react to feedback that we get and use that as a basis for future behavior. So let's talk about some of the key ideas here in operant conditioning. According to Skinner and most people who believe in operant conditioning, there are three basic ways that after something happens to us, we can experience a reaction. And depending on what kind of reaction you experience, that's either going to encourage or discourage you from doing it in the future. So the first type of reinforcement that you can get, reaction that you can get, is called positive reinforcement. Now, positive reinforcement is when after you do something, you are likely to strengthen or increase the use of that behavior because a positive condition is experienced and increased as a result. So, in other words, you learn that doing something is going to get you a positive reaction, so you do it more. It's a pretty simple concept when you think about it. To give you a real world example of positive reinforcement, when you learn that you will get an allowance for doing your chores, that strengthens the chance of you doing your chores over time. So you do your chores because you expect that positive reinforcement. And we call it positive reinforcement because it's strengthening the behavior. So it's not about what you get, it's about whether or not what you experience in terms of reinforcement is encouraging, strengthening that behavior. You're going to do your chores more. You're strengthening the likelihood of doing your chores by the condition that you experience afterwards, getting an allowance. So that's positive reinforcement. Another way that we can get reinforced and the behavior can be strengthened is when we have something called negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is also strengthening the behavior because a negative condition that you were experiencing is decreased. So in negative reinforcement, again, you're strengthening a behavior that you've done. You're getting reinforcement for doing something, and the reinforcement that you're getting is something bad is getting taken away. So some examples of negative reinforcement. Let's think about a couple of these. For example, one example of negative reinforcement would be when you learn over time, those of you who commute to school, those of you who commute to Towson, when you learn over time that leaving for school earlier and earlier means spending less time in heavy traffic, you're going to be more likely to leave for school earlier. So that behavior, leaving for school earlier, is getting strengthened because a negative condition, experiencing heavy traffic, is decreased. So it's negative reinforcement because you're strengthening the behavior and something bad gets taken away. Some other examples of negative reinforcement. When you learn, for those of you who maybe get migraine headaches, when you learn that you can avoid getting a migraine headache by taking something like Excedrin, you're going to keep taking the Excedrin to avoid the pain that you would experience with a migraine. So you're strengthening the behavior, taking the Excedrin, because a negative condition, getting a really bad headache, is decreased. So that's negative reinforcement. Now, the opposite of that, when you're actually experiencing something that's going to weaken your behavior, that's just what we call punishment. So punishments are things that are going to weaken or decrease your acting it and behaving in a certain way because a negative condition is experienced as a consequence. And I'm sure we all have experience with punishments, but punishments are things that are either that are given to us or have things taken away from us because a negative experience, a negative condition is experienced as a consequence. So, some classic examples of punishment. I mean, you can go right to crime and criminal justice. Giving someone a prison sentence is that's a punishment because we're hoping that that weakens their future criminal behaviors. So it's hoped that one of the points of prison is by giving someone this negative condition, you'll weaken their future criminal behavior. Pretty simple idea. That's a punishment. Something maybe more relevant to your lives, giving a student detention when he or she acts up. Those are given out to hopefully decrease that bad behavior in the future. So these are some of the ideas, the core basis really of operant conditioning. Depending on the kind of reinforcement or punishment that we experience, our behaviors are either going to be strengthened or weakened over time. And we keep responding and perceiving the feedback that we're getting, and that plays a large role in whether or not we're going to do good and bad things over time. So criminologists who believe in the importance of this research about behaviorism think that people's reinforcement and punishment for over time plays a really large role in their criminality. To give you an example, some people believe that if you're never properly punished for bad behavior as a child, you're going to keep acting out and your behavior is going to get more and more serious and eventually criminal. That's an operant conditioning, a behavioral explanation for why someone commits crime. They were never properly punished, so that behavior was never properly weakened, discouraged. Another example would be, if you think about it in terms of the reinforcement aspect of it, some people get rewarded for acts of violence by their friends in terms of status and gaining respect. So that's an example of positive reinforcement. You're going to be more likely to keep acting violent and tough and getting into fights and assaulting people if a positive condition, getting status and respect from your friends, is getting increased. So those are the ideas in operant conditioning. And later on in the semester, when we talk about people who've actually developed theories called learning theories in crime, you'll see that all of these ideas come back into play. There are a couple more psychological positivists that are useful to talk about, but really probably the most famous one, the one that you all, if any of you have ever taken a psychology class, might have some experience with, is the work of Albert Bandura. And Albert Bandura is famous for his work on aggression. And he's really most famous for a study that he did in 1973 that most people tend to refer to now as the Bobo doll study. And really the key point that he was trying to make in this study was that aggression isn't something inherent. It isn't something that you're born with and people have set levels of. According to Bandura, people learn their aggression. We learn how to be aggressive and violent by observing and mimicking others doing aggressive and violent behaviors. So in his famous study, and I apologize for the graininess of these photos, but it's from 1973. So in his study, he did a study with small children, and he wanted to see whether or not children observed someone behaving aggressively toward an object and whether or not they would imitate that behavior. So what he did is he had children stand on one side of a two-way glass, and on the other side, they watched a woman in a room, a playroom, a room with toys in it, and they watched the woman interact with this blow-up doll that we now call the Bobo doll. So you can see from these kind of grainy pictures here, the woman kind of gets on top of it and smacks it. She throws it around a little bit. She punches the Bobo doll. She basically behaves violently and aggressively towards this doll. Now, what Bandura did is after he let kids experience this and watch this woman do it, he let those kids into this playroom. He didn't give them any instructions. The Bobo doll was there, but so were other toys. And what he found is that kids who got let into this playroom and told that they could kind of do whatever they want immediately went for the Bobo doll and started doing the actions that they had just watched this woman do through the glass. So they were throwing it around, beating it with objects in the room. They were not playing, nicely with it. They were acting in an aggressive manner. And Albert Bandura took this experiment as evidence of the fact that kids learn how to be aggressive and violent. We have to learn violence. So it's an example of someone who really believes that unlike maybe the more biological theorists and people who believe that we have things like violence and aggression are predetermined, learning psychologists, behaviorists like Albert Bandura do experiments to try to prove that while some things might be inherent, a lot of what we do is a result of learning and mimicking. The final area in terms of psychology and crime, would involve looking at the research that has been done to try to show a link between a person's intelligence and their criminal behavior. So, does your level of intelligence decrease or increase your likelihood of getting into trouble, committing crime? You can trace this back many, many, many years, and really kind of the most referenced person that you can trace this research back to is a researcher back in the early 20th century called Charles Goring. And Goring believed in a concept called feeble-mindedness that was a concept that had started several decades before, but he really extensively wrote about in his papers. So he believed that criminals can be differentiated from non-criminals because of their mental capacity. He studied prisoners and compared them to people who were not in prison, and believed that he could prove through his research that prisoners have a lower mental age. Prisoners are less mentally developed. And he thought that lower amount of mental development plays a really large role in them committing crimes. Now, this concept, being mentally stunted, having a lower mental age, was what he called feeble-mindedness. And this was a concept that people tried to study a lot and tried to measure whether or not people were feeble-minded. In some of the first tests that happened on this, it was actually done testing soldiers that were trying to enlist for World War I. And the first IQ tests, the first people that actually tried to measure intelligence level, mental age, were people that were developing tests as a result of people like Gore's research. So this idea of IQ, the idea of having a test that can in some way capture a person's mental age, these tests first emerged in the World War I era. And historically, when it has been measured on criminal subjects, when you give people who are either arrested or in prison IQ tests, historically they have lower levels. So all else being equal, it does seem like testing low on these IQ tests, these intelligence tests, indicates that you're going to be more likely to commit crime. But in a lot of ways, the tests that people like Goring and others have done to try to make a really definite link between intelligence and crime have largely been disproven. And the reason for that is the idea that IQ tests actually accurately capture a person's mental age, a person's intelligence, is something that not a lot of scholars really believe in. For any of you who've ever gone through an IQ test, when you get an IQ test, it's supposed to be, your IQ number is supposed to be something that's stable. You can be given this test at any point in your life, and it's supposed to be able to capture fairly accurately your mental capacity, your intelligence. Well, not everyone believes that IQ tests can actually do that. And a lot of people believe that there are cultural biases in place in IQ testing. Specifically, the idea here is that IQ tests were designed by white, middle, and upper class men who designed it based on their experiences and educations. And the criticism is that children who are not raised in the same kind of cultural situation aren't going to do as well on it. Not necessarily because they're not as smart, but they don't have some of the background and some of the knowledge and experiences that the people who develop the test assume most people do. So basically the idea is IQ tests are not supposed to be things that test your education. They're not supposed to be able to test, they're not designed to test your knowledge, but a lot of people argue that they do, because people who do better in school, who stay in school for longer, have better IQ tests. So one of the complications is school failure, something that a lot of kids who get into delinquency and crime experience, often test low on IQ testing, and some people believe that's more because of their lack of education than their actual mental capacity and intelligence. So the point here is that Many criminologists now really think that the low IQ and crime link is confounded by a lot of other factors that also correlate with a person getting a low score on an IQ test in crime. So we do think that there is some link. There is a small suggestion, a small correlation suggesting that people who score lower on IQ tests are more likely to commit crime. But not many people believe it's because they are actually feeble minded anymore. They believe that it is due to a host of other factors. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about the shift that we've experienced over the past couple years, talking about psychological theory and policy. And really, one thing that you can really mark the psychological theory development in criminology in terms of its link to policy is from about the 1890s to the 1960s, when these psychological explanations for criminal behavior were getting developed. We really shifted in emphasis. And the emphasis shifted away from what is it about a person's neighborhood that makes them criminal to why is this individual a criminal? So psychological theories of crime really aren't as interested in understanding a person's social or environmental background. They're much more interested in studying individual psychological traits of individual people. And because of that, because of this focus on individuals and individuals' ability to change, what happened and what came out of psychological theory in terms of how we can link it to policy is this era that psychological theory developed in, which we call positivism, encouraged the idea that people who have these problems, these psychological issues that cause them to commit crime, these things can be rehabilitated. These aren't necessarily things that they're inherently born with. These are things that they either learned or developed in their childhood, and they can be taught out of them. You can teach someone and rehabilitate them and correct these behaviors that they've learned how to do over time. So this is the time period from the 1890s to really the 1960s, and even to some extent today. People started calling prisons correctional facilities. For those of you who have a correctional facility anywhere near where you grew up or you ever driven by one, the reason that we called them, that we started to call them correctional facilities, was people genuinely believed, especially at the beginning of this era, that prisoners could be corrected, rehabilitated. Juvenile facilities, they stopped being called houses of refuge and detention centers, and they started being called reformatories. Juveniles were sent to reformatories, and the very name of it suggests people were hoping that these places would reform and correct these juveniles' behavior. And really, the biggest thing that came out of this period was instead of trying to have really uniform, equal punishments for people who committed certain types of crimes, the focus back during this time period was on the individual, designing individual punishments. And really what came out of it was instead of sending someone to prison for a very definite amount of time, giving someone a sentence saying, you're going to serve 20 to 25 years, that really wasn't in place for the majority of the 20th century. What we used to do, and what we still sometimes do, is we sentence people to a fairly broad range of time. You're going to serve 5 to 15 years. And the people would come up periodically throughout that time period while they were in prison and come before parole boards. And the whole point of having a parole board system was so that people who were trained to evaluate progress in prison could ask individual prisoners, have you been rehabilitated? Are you sorry for what you did? What would you do if you got let out? You've probably seen depictions of parole board hearings before. The whole point of those is to try to assess whether or not somebody has been rehabilitated. Are they still a danger to society, or have they experienced a change? And all of that came out of this positivist psychological era, this focus on individual change. Now, we've kind of come out of that in recent years, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on in the class, but parole boards and the use of parole is actually being kind of phased out of our system now, and we're becoming much more certain and severe with our punishments. We're in an era where society and legislators are much less concerned about rehabilitating people and much more concerned about having fair, equal, and serious punishments. Okay, so that's the end of today's lecture. Now, as you all know, the next time that we meet in person on Thursday, you're going to have your first exam. The exam is going to be, for the most part, multiple choice questions and true-false questions. It's a Scantron-based exam. So please remember to bring a number 2 pencil that has an eraser. I won't have any to give you, and you need a pencil to take the exam, so please bring a pencil with you. And also bring your student ID, as I will probably have you write your ID number somewhere on the Scantron. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to contact me before the exam. Otherwise, I will see you Thursday.